Hi, Vincent Hall, and welcome to another episode of Anyone Can Draw, Paint, and Create. As promised, we're moving away from Sgraffito and all those feathery drawings and into something different, yet has some of the similar vibe. We're going to learn how to draw reflection. Specifically, how do you draw something that's glass or metallic and make it look like it's glass or metallic? And the whole key is to draw the shapes inside the reflection. So what I've done is set up a small still life for myself using 3 different sized plain glass objects. Now, if you wanted to get really into it and had some faceted glass, like those little bud vases that have all the crystal glass etchings and cuts, go for it. But we're going to keep it simple today and just use basic glass. So I have 3 things that I'll show you in a minute here. I have 2 different sized wine glasses and then just an old antique milk bottle from way back, or maybe it's from a milk company, but I don't know if it had milk in it now that I look at it. Anyway, we're going to be doing that with just a pencil and an eraser. So we're going to keep it simple, but we're also going to add, believe it or not, some water to the pencil in order to soften things. Yes, graphite is water soluble. So let's get started and we'll see where this takes us. So what I've set up here are 3 different glasses, and this green background is just a piece of paper. I'll kind of go on an angle here so you can see. I have a piece of paper that I just propped up with some other containers behind it so I could fold it. If you've been in my photography class, you know all about this kind of idea of having a soft, use my paintbrush to point, like a soft curve here on the paper so that it's not folded in half. It'll just give you a nicer background. If you don't have a colored piece of paper, white would do. You could use a sheet, any kind of material, or just draw what you see behind it. But for beginning learning how to draw these highlights and these shadows and all the reflections in glass, I thought it was best to use a neutral background. So this is what I'm going to be drawing from, and we'll try to turn the camera so you can see as I'm moving in progress. The key to drawing shadows and highlights in glass is to make sure that where you see a highlight, like right here where I see this sharp highlight from where the light's reflecting, and then here, that you don't draw that all in with solid pencil, because then it'll just give us an outline. Conversely, where we see these dark areas, we want to make sure we draw those. If you like jigsaw puzzles, this project is for you. Now, I could take these things out and just practice drawing one glass. So if you're a new beginner and you don't want to get too involved, you can try drawing just one thing. That's fine too. Anyway, this is what I'm working from, so you have an idea of what I'm doing and where I'm going. Let's get started with the drawing. As you see from the example I just showed you of what I'm going to be working with, it's 3 different layers, so we're going to start out by just drawing the basic shapes. Now, if you can draw the letter U, you can draw a wine goblet, because basically this is just a U shape with a top, and the stem is just a straight line. So it shouldn't be too difficult to get some of those things in. I'm going to start by using what we all remember from school, the ubiquitous yellow number 2 pencil. This pencil is a basic lead weight, and it's going to give us a nice light line that we can then go back and erase. And speaking of erasers, these pink erasers, they get hard and wear out with age. So probably it won't erase too well, but it's beautiful as a blender. So simple tools, great drawings. Wait till you see. I'm going to start with where I see my highest point, and I'm just going to draw little dots. So if you've been down in the drawing class, you know I'm all about plot points because they help you see where things taper. And I'm drawing the bottle that's in the background first. And I'm just drawing some little dots about where I think this bottle ends and starts. And then I'm just drawing the wider thing. And the beauty is if I just connect these shapes, I should get something that looks a lot like what that long and narrow bottle looked like in the back of my, my drawing, still life drawing idea. And I'm seeing just a little bit of the top, so I connect those lines. And that's it. So if you get a rough outline of just one shape, that's fine. Now I'm pressing a little harder so that you can see this, but feel free to press light. Then I'm going to my next shape, which is the wine glass. And I'm just looking at where I want to have the width and the height of this and where it comes into the stem by drawing 2 more little dots. And then I can just come out and around, but at least I know where I'm going with this so that I can get the idea of the stem. And then this is a straight line down. And then this gets a little tricky, this half loop here. So if you have something, now I have a jar here for water for later, but you could use something like this if you wanted to trace around a half circle to get the bottom of the wine glass, which is just what I just did. And then just connect that bottom half to the top. And it's an easy way to get the stem of the glass, and it's off a little bit, so I'll erase that later. To see the inside of the top of a glass, just think of drawing an oval. So I'm just lightly drawing that oval in, and now I've got my back and my front. A lot of this line is going to be erased, but we're just getting outlines in to start. That's gonna drive me crazy. So I'm gonna just fix this line here because that glass was just a little too small. Maybe something like a roll of tape might work better, depending on if you have a glass with a stem. Then my front glass, I'm just looking at where does it go in relationship to my bottle, and it comes out a little bit. So my 2 points here, and then where does it end? It comes down further than everything else. And this one, because it's lower, I'm seeing more of the inside of this glass. Then I'm tapering around, and it comes around here and tapering around, and then I just connect my dots. So by having some dots, you can get the drawing ideas. So here's what I have so far. See if you can see that in this lighting here. We're just doing dots and basic outline. Now comes the fun. For me, this is a lot like putting together a puzzle. So I'm just going to start by drawing an outline of where I see my highlights. And then I'm going to be able to erase this out later. So if you just start with one, the key is don't skip around if you have more than one bottle. Now, if you only have one, that's fine. But if you have more than one, don't be tempted to start going all over the place because you really have to be methodical about glass reflection. And I'm just drawing the shape of everywhere I see an absolute white highlight on this glass. And eventually I'm gonna make this white. But you can see these are some pretty different shapes right here. And the idea, hold this paper flat, is that we're trying to get a little bit of the basic highlight shape. Now the next one here is just a little bit of a lighter shape, followed by a second one, and followed by a little one here. And then you talk to yourself. You can hear how I'm talking to myself this whole way down. I'm gonna correct that. Make this a little lighter. There's a little lightness on the stem. Then I'll come down to my last glass where I see a highlight. Now, whatever light you have on in the house, those are the highlights that you're going to see. And if you don't have an overhead light, maybe your highlights will be much more different than mine. Okay, so I have these weird little shapes in where I'm going to eventually change this to white. And that's what I'm going to do right now. I'm changing it to white by doing 2 things. First, now I'm going to erase where my line was because a light highlight isn't going to have a dark outline edge, and that's something to remember. Then I'm taking my white color pencil and I'm just going in. Now, if you're working on white paper, this is where you would just leave it white. I'm working on toned paper again because it's a little bit easier to see. And it's also, it reflects better or picks up the reflections better for you to be able to see with the camera. But feel free to just use plain old white paper. If all you have is computer paper at home, that's fine too. So I'm just drawing in my highlights and then making sure I take that eraser and get rid of the areas that have an outline around it once I fill that in, and then going back in with the white. These white graphite pencils tend to wear down pretty quickly. So I'm coming down here, and now that I see I had a white reflection here, And I'm doing all the little tiny highlights first, the whitest whites, because we're going to use wet graphite to get all these subtle shadows. Now, if you don't want to wet the graphite, that's fine too. You see another one here. These are just lines. So sometimes you connect the line by just drawing a white line down here, if I can move this up. So I erased the whole outline edge because this is picking up some interesting little lines and shadows. Let me erase these out. So keep your eraser handy. As you see where you're going with this, you can erase it out either before or after, or just make it a lighter line. But you just want to practice getting these lines in. So this is what I've drawn so far. And you can see it's just the highlights and it's just the outline and where I erased some of the outline. That's the idea of trying to get just the shadows on. So this is where you should be right now. Just your whitest whites and then the outline of where everything else is. So I'll remove this and you can see, I'll move down to the right angle. This is what I'm getting the inspiration from. So I've got a long ways to go, but the idea is we get the brightest areas in first. So now I'm going to continue with my middle values. So now what I'm going to do is get my middle values in with the light grays. And again, I'm just using my plain old basic pencil. And I'm going to start shading lightly in these areas and going darker where I see darker and lighter where I see lighter. Now, the interesting thing about shadows and highlights is usually where you see your lightest highlight, somewhere next to it, you're going to see your darkest value. So you can keep that in mind as you're going around through this. And I'm just going to lightly tone this in. Again, if you're using white paper, you might want to just leave your whites be the paper and everything else is going to get toned in. Since I already have a middle value paper, I'm just going to use my gray paper as my middle value and just shade in everything that's darker than my paper surface. So I'm just kind of quickly going to lay some of this area in, getting my darkest darks. Now the interesting thing is the bottom of this bottle has some pretty dark darks going around the inside of it, and it gets distorted as you see it through the other side of the bottle. So don't draw what you think, draw what you see. It'll make a big difference in how happy you are with the finished product. So I'm ignoring this glass for now because it's all by itself over here anyway, and I want to make sure I get these shadows in just where I see them. And you could spend all day doing glass shadows and reflections. I've done it. Back in my undergrad days, we had to do 24-hour drawings of reflections and 24-hour drawings of people. And that means 24 solid hours, not just draw it in a day of 24 hours. So it can take a lot of time, and you don't have to work on this all at once. You can certainly come back to it. But I'm just changing my pencil. Sometimes I'm going vertical, sometimes I'm going horizontal, and I'll stop here in a minute so you can see what I have. As soon as I make sure I have what I need. You've got to go a little darker next to this. Right at this point, it's going to start to look a little bit splotchy. And I notice here that there's some highlights that I missed, and that happens too. You might have to go back in and recreate some lighter highlights where everything goes. But this is what I have with the light shadows in. And you can see it's starting to get that reflective quality of glass. But we're not done yet, because as promised, the beauty of this is you can blend this in a couple of ways. You can use the eraser, but as a blender. So I'm not really erasing, I'm just smoothing out. Now, if you have a really good new pencil, don't do this. This is an old yellow pencil, so the eraser's hard. So it actually works more as a smudger. And you can see I'm holding it on its side. I'm getting no eraser crumbs. I'm just getting this really beautiful softness that I want to get where I'm blending in the shadows. You can also use a regular blender, one of these things. Here's a thin one and a thick one, or you can even use a Q-tip. All of these things are going to be a soft way to blend in, and I've turned my paper horizontally so that I can just do a better movement because I'm better going up and down. Again, this is all just personal preference. It's also a little easier to see this paper turned this direction, I noticed, due to the fact of shadows when we go vertical with this still life that I have set up, because it is casting some shadows. So I'm just going around and softening in the areas that I have already colored in, just to give it a little more tonal variation. And then I'll turn it back this way and move this down so you can see this part here. We can zoom in a little bit. Right where I see some secondary shadows and highlights, I can now use my eraser to go back out and get some of those middle values where the darks got too darks, and try to modify some of my highlights. So I'm just adding a little bit of that. So I'm gonna work on getting this finished with the dry shading, and then I'll be right back and you will see how we can use wet graphite to really finish our drawing. So what I did was finish pretty much the shading part without what we're going to do regarding the wet part of graphite. And we're also going to add in some shadows, because down in this area, we want to make sure these look grounded and not like we have some sort of strange gravity resistant glasses. So we're going to ground them by adding a shadow on the bottom. So I used my regular pencil. Actually, I have a softer lead pencil and a regular one. So this is an HB or a number 2. And then this one is a number 6. So if you do have a set of drawing pencils at home and you want to try using a softer lead for shading, I like the 6Bs because they're really soft and they give you a nice tone. And maybe you don't want to even go with the water, but it's fun to try. So you could either wet the pencil. So I'm going to show you what happens if I just stick my pencil here in water and then zoom down here, so hopefully you can see, and I come in this area. It's going to be subtle, but you can see it's starting to softly blend this. It almost looks now more like charcoal. So you can just wet the tip, but what I like to do is to use a paintbrush. If you don't have a paintbrush, you could use your Q-tip. I mean, that works too, but I'm going to use paintbrush. So I'm just wetting my paintbrush, and then I'm going in right here where you can see some of these details, and I'm blending it out, and I just love what graphite does when it gets wet. It's really cool. It starts to look like a charcoal drawing without the mess. And they do sell water-soluble graphite pencils, but I found out all graphite pencils will respond to water. It's just a matter of how much water. And I'm using, if you're a painter, this is a fun exercise to warm up before you do an actual painting with paint, because we are moving things around with the brush. And this is a really stiff brush, so you don't need anything too hard. A semi-wet Q-tip will work. And as the water dries off, I'm just getting the soft areas. Now, the key is don't do this all like huge wet everywhere. We're just using a little bit of water. I'll dry off my brush. I'll come over here to this goblet so you can see here. I'm just going over the areas that are the darkest and filling them in a little bit, and then letting it go and using what's left on my brush, just like you would use with charcoal, to add your little half tones. But I'm not spreading water over everything, because that way it wouldn't work. You wouldn't get the effect you like. Now, the room I'm sitting in has some Venetian blinds, so it's casting these weird little white lines. So that's why I drew in some crazy little lines. Again, you have to draw what you see, not what you know, because what you know is you probably wouldn't see funny little lines. And then here I'm just going down and softly picking up the graphite and shading in the top of the bottle, which seems to have a lot more. And see, oh, that's really pretty, how that just developed this little bit of a really dark edge. Because it's those last 5% of things that you do with the drawing that make or break it. And look at how darker my graphite got by wetting it. It's just so much fun to do, because it's like putting together a puzzle. Now, I do have to be careful to look at what I'm doing while I'm talking. It's probably going to be easier for you maybe to not talk so much to someone, but we're all social isolating, so that's okay. We can talk to ourselves. But talking actually puts your other half of your brain in motion, and it becomes a little more difficult to focus on the right brain or the creative, intuitive side. I'm just gonna finish this off a little bit here. So where I had my darkest graphite, I'm just going around it with a little bit of water. And I think I'm gonna leave this go and just show you how to finish this drawing with some shadows. Go right in here, clean that up. Okay, so for the shadows, what we're going to do is take that softer pencil again, and I'm looking at my picture, and I just see some little shapes. Now, I'm not gonna go crazy with all the shadows and highlights in the shadows for a beginner drawing, but these shadows of glass will have a lot of variables. I'm just doing some of the basics. And this over here, this one doesn't really have a shadow. It kind of, the stem goes into this, but these two do. And if you're drawing it up against something and you want to show that shadow, which I will do here, just so you can see it, what I'm doing is coming down into this area and just getting the back end of this bottle because there is a shadow behind it. And it's darker further away from the object. And then this glass casts a lighter shadow. And then the stem casts one here. And then this other one's in front of everything. So there's really no shadow going on there. There's a little bit behind it. And then this is where the beauty of either the blender. So you can see here I'm using my blender for the shadow. If you want a dry brush, I'll do the shadow in dry here. This is dry medium, not dry brush. I'm sorry. The painter in me just came out. So I'll do my back shadows using a blender. I'm going the opposite direction from how I shaded in my graphite. But then down here where I have darker shadows, I'll go back to my brush and just kind of get in these really dark shadows by blending in my graphite. The softer the graphite pencil, the darker your shadows are going to be when they're wet. Now it is harder to erase this out once it's wet, so you have to be a little cognizant of what you're going to get. I'll wet this down a little bit more here, but I did want a pretty hard cast shadow on these two that are down here because that's what I'm seeing as opposed to up here, although up here it's a little darker. So I'm going to use the water, sorry about that, we're down here, up here, so that you can see what I'm doing. And I'm just using water, dipping my brush, getting it mostly dry on a paper towel, and kind of just going around the edge of this shadow because there is a pretty dark shadow behind this little burst there. And this one does not have that dark of a shadow, so I'm not going to do it except right here. It's a little darker as we come down. So to make this shadow work, I'm just going to go in a little bit darker right in here. And I'm pretty much going to call it a day with this drawing. Now, if you wanted to go back in, you could go back with your white pencil and add any highlights that might have come out. Like I see here, I need to add a little one. But you just talk to yourself and find where you want to go. And that's pretty much the end of my reflection of glass drawing. I hope you enjoyed this lesson in drawing glass. I've had some requests about doing things that involve reflective devices or reflective imagery, so I thought this would be a good start. Don't get too afraid of trying it. Like I said, you can try just drawing one little glass and drawing all these little highlights and reflections of what you see through it. It's a good exercise, even if you don't want to draw something reflective, to warm up for another kind of drawing or painting. This one just engages the right side of your brain so that you're looking at shapes and form and not subject. So when I was drawing this, I'm not drawing it and seeing it as, ooh, I've got a tall glass, a small glass, another glass. I'm looking at, do I have a triangle highlight? Do I have line highlights? Do I have shadows here, shadows there? So I'm talking to myself internally about what shapes I might be seeing. So you might be saying, well, that's great, but I don't really want to draw a still life of glass. What am I going to do with that? Well, maybe you're working on a portrait. Guess what? Eyes have reflections. You can see right now in mine, it's something called a catch light. So learning how to see those light areas in an eye and not just make them look like a solid dark orb or totally white will help you in portraits. Maybe in portraits, somebody's wearing shiny earrings, so you might be drawing the reflections and the highlights that you see on a metallic surface. If you're drawing animals, especially maybe something amphibious like a lizard, or it could be a fish or something that might be wet, there's going to be shadows and highlights and reflections too. Even if you're drawing a house, there's windows. So the list goes on. Reflections happen more in life than we think, and it's really important to learn how to master those to be happy with your drawing or your painting. Again, everything we do as a drawing can easily translate to a painting, especially since we were using our handy dandy brush for part of this drawing. I hope you enjoyed this week's lesson. What follows will be some examples of reflective drawings in addition to the photo and the finished drawing of what I just did. If you want to come down in the Art Center, we do the beginning to intermediate and advanced drawing class every Wednesday from noon to 2. So I look forward to seeing you then, or virtually on air for our drawing lessons. Till next week, stay safe and be well, Vincent Hall.